Our lead story tonight is a story about a lead story, the one about the war on drugs. Seldom has a continuing running story taken over television news programs and newspaper and magazine space like it has in recent months. There has been an onrush of television specials, magazine cover stories, and newspaper series, as well as a flow of regular news items. We had two in our news summary tonight, in fact. One about Mrs. Reagan and Education Secretary Bennett observing drug-free days in the schools. The other about the not guilty plea entered by the couple turned in by their daughter on drug possession charges. Is all of this too much? Has the news media gone overboard, hyped and overdone a story and a problem way beyond what they deserve? Well, there are now critics within the media who say yes, yes, yes to all those questions, and we will join that argument with four leading journalists in a moment, after June Massell reminds us of what has been going on these last few months.
If you didn't read about it in your local newspaper, you probably bought a magazine that had an article on drug abuse. Newsweek alone did 3 cover stories in the last 6 months, telling us that there was a drug epidemic striking Middle America. Time weighed in with 2 cover stories and a cover line, telling us about drug use on the job and the enemy within. If drug abuse was good copy, it also was good TV.
In cities all across the country, the biggest problem for police right now is crack.
And local television news jumped on the bandwagon.
Undercover cops have just made a bomb.
Nightly, we were shown the victims of drug abuse, victims like star athletes Len Bias and Don Rogers. The politicians and President Reagan responded.
Drugs, in one way or the other, are victimizing all of us. And that's why I'm here today, to announce 6 major goals of what we hope will be the final stage in our national strategy to eradicate drug abuse.
The networks declared their own war on drugs. The MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour devoted 2 weeks to a series on drugs and related problems. The evening news broadcasts of CBS, NBC, and ABC also found drug abuse to be a hot topic. Since the beginning of March, NBC News has done 429 reports on drug abuse, a total of 16 hours and 51 minutes of airtime. And during the first week of September, CBS brought us 48 Hours on Crack Street, which according to the Nielsen ratings had 15 million viewers, a record number for documentaries.
We begin the argument over whether it's been all too much with 2 employees of the same corporation. Richard Cohen is a columnist for The Washington Post. Richard Smith is the editor-in-chief of Newsweek magazine, which is owned by the Washington Post Company. Smith wrote recently in his magazine, "A drug epidemic is abroad in America, as pervasive and as dangerous in its way as the plagues of medieval times." Cohen wrote last week in his column, "The answer when it comes to drugs is simple. There is no worsening epidemic. There is only worsening journalism." Richard Cohen, how is it worsening journalism?
Well, I think there is absolutely no statistical evidence to show that there is a worsening epidemic of drugs. In fact, there is evidence to prove just the opposite. And almost any drug you can name, with the possible exception of cocaine, but even with cocaine, most of the data shows that there is less and less abuse of those drugs. So I think it's insupportable to talk about, 1, an epidemic, because an epidemic by its very nature means it's spreading, and 2, to talk about a worsening epidemic when the data prove just the opposite.
Well, then what happened? What's behind all of this? Why are magazines like Newsweek, Time, the networks, and everybody else reporting it as such?
Well, I think there are a number of answers to that. The first is I would be the last to say there is no drug problem. Clearly there's a drug problem. The American press has reported on the drug problem for the last 20 or 25 years, as long as I can remember it. Second thing I think is the drugs are good copy. They're better film, by the way. I mean, the gripping footage that you can show of people overdosed on drugs or police bus is probably the best stuff you can see on television. I think, lastly, there is a great anxiety in this country, not only about drugs, but about our children, the way we're raising our children. And drugs is only the last or the most recent example of that sort of thing. It wasn't too long ago we worried about rock lyrics, obscene rock lyrics, then it was pornography, then it was abducted children, then it was child molestation, then it was the sexual abuse of children. We've had a kind of a pattern of this, wave after wave after wave, and the concern has generally been children, and generally the concern has been incredibly hyped.
Richard Smith, has Newsweek overdone it?
Oh, I think anybody can take issue with particular cover calls. I think, in fact, the media in general has been a little late coming to the drug story. I think what happened earlier this year was that particularly in the southern tier of the United States, there was a sense that the borders were completely permeable to an inflow of drugs, and I think that while the statistics don't show a dramatic increase or maybe flat in some areas, I think the emergence of the drug crack crystallized a lot of thinking about the drug problem. Here you had a drug that was relatively cheap, relatively easy to manufacture, and highly addictive. And I think that that breakthrough alone, if that's what we want to call it, focused a lot of attention on the drug issue. And it seems to me that to argue that because we're focusing a lot of attention on a drug like crack, we're overdoing it, is by logical extension to argue that because there are only 10,000 AIDS victims in the United States right now, we shouldn't cover that because, after all, it's only 10,000.
You do not have any second thoughts about using words like a plague, comparable to, something comparable to the plague of medieval times, epidemic, all those things that bother Richard Cohen?
Well, I think that there's always room for second thoughts, and I think that Richard, as a pal and an acquaintance, raises some good points. I think that what we can't escape is the fact that, as far as Americans polled are concerned, this is the #1 public problem that they cite in the polling data. And I think it's only by giving this issue the kind of coverage it deserves that we'll get down to the questions of how to deal with it.
Yeah.
In the process, there's been excess, and perhaps we've been part of that excess. But you don't get from here to recognizing the problem to here without solving, or just towards solving the problem, without looking at it extensively.
Richard Cohen, what is the harm? Let's assume for discussion purposes that the thing has been overdone. What's the harm of overdoing something about a problem like drugs?
Well, I think you can see the harm in what the United States Congress has done and the way it's reacted. I mean, it's one thing to be concerned about a problem. It's another thing when it reaches the point of panic. And you've got a panic here in Washington. You have some very ill-advised legislation that just went through the House of Representatives in something like 2 or 3 hours. You've got lots of people reacting around the country with mandatory drug tests, with all kinds of alleged or real violations of the Constitution. You've got some serious problems when you start talking about something as an epidemic or as a panic, when in fact you ought to deal with it as a concern and deal with it in a reasonable sort of way. As I said before, I would be the last person to say that there isn't a drug problem or that the media shouldn't deal with drugs. What I'm saying is that if we, all of us, are responsible for the hype and the panic, then we ought to answer for it. Then I think we have something to answer for.
I think those are legitimate points. I think Washington has gone crazy over this problem, but it's part of the media's job, it seems to me, to come back and raise those questions about the accuracy of drug testing, the legality of drug testing, raise the privacy issues on that issue alone. And we did that this week. And I think that's part of the ongoing coverage of the drug problem, to take a look at the proposals that are being made for dealing with it.
In other words, create the panic and then report the panic?
You say create the panic.
No, that's just a question. No, but I mean, that's Richard Cohen's point. That's his charge, that the news media, that we, and I'm not saying they, that we created the panic and now we're going to report the panic. Is that?
I'm not sure that I buy the argument that there's been a panic created. I think that people in Washington are responding to what the people are saying, and I think that we can set the public agenda to a certain degree by getting issues out in the open. But as much as we write about the deficit, we're not exactly producing a groundswell of legislation to deal with it.
Can
All
I?
right, let's, yeah, just a second, Richard. I want to bring two others into the discussion now. They are Hodding Carter, media critic, former newspaper editor, and State Department spokesman, now host of the public television program Capital Journal, and columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and Vernon Jarrett, a columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times and a regular commentator on WLS-TV Chicago. He joins us from Chicago. Hodding Carter, which came first, the public concern or the media's coverage?
Well, first, there's been real public concern because drugs have gone out of the closet, which is to say out of the place where they were contained with very little media coverage, which is in low-income and isolated America, and is now out among middle-class America. Therefore, it becomes a matter that troubles suburban America, which is what you really wish to deal with, both at Newsweek and at MacNeil Lehrer and everything else in this business. Second thing is, there's no question that what the media has done on the drug problem is to throw the blood in the water and then look back and say, my, the sharks are feeding on this blood in Congress. Well, the fact is, this is a media-created hype now being reacted to by Congress, which certainly can't do anything practical about what is a real set of pressing problems. So it's going to enact unconstitutional and otherwise stupid legislation impinging on rights in the name of what is not really the drug problem of America. If we are going to deal with a drug problem in America, let's deal with what a publication just came across my desk this morning refers to. 300,000, 400,000 Americans, they claim, these internists, killed each year by a highly addictive epidemic drug called tobacco, or a highly addictive, low-cost epidemic drug called alcohol. But of course, those have been the drugs of choice of a great majority of Americans for a long time. They're not news. They're not worthy of 3 cover stories in 5 months. They're not worthy of insanely hyped up television series. No, this is a game that we, once more, have indulged in, and I have to tell you, every now and then the critics are right. We play it for the market.
Vernon Jarrett, do you agree with Hodding Carter and Richard Cohen?
Agree, but I think I'm in disagreement with just about everything the media has been doing, other than the fact that they have dramatized the quantitative aspect of drug use in this country. But no one is asking the essential questions about why. Why would you have someone on Wall Street, or in our little Wall Street here in Chicago called LaSalle Street, successful young stockbrokers who have to use coke to enjoy themselves? I think we need to call some kind of summit meeting of some of the great minds from our universities, our philosophers, and certainly those of religion, to understand, at least to weigh the fact that maybe we are witnessing something of a historic nature, and that is the bust of the American dream. There are young people who have no logical reason to use drugs other than they are dissatisfied with success and what is. Why would a distinguished athlete who never had a dream of making the money that he's making reach the pinnacle, popularity, everybody loves him, and yet he finds out this is not what he wanted, this is not what he sought, he needs drugs? Why would there be such an epidemic of not only drugs, but suicide in high school? 31%, according to a recent poll by Who's Who in High School America, 31% of our young people who are achievers have contemplated suicide at some point. Drugs just don't come out of a vacuum. What is wrong that you'd have an epidemic of suicide in an affluent suburb of Texas?
So
you see, we don't want to tackle these problems because I think they expose something that we don't want to admit to the world.
But back to the drug thing for a moment, then I take what you're saying, that the news media has not only not hyped this thing, they haven't even covered it as well as you think it should be, and as much as it should be covered.
They have been superficial. Superficial. It is no accident that you've got some of our finest entertainers and people in our own media who are making 6 figures a year, but they found out, is this all it is? I need some coke? There's something wrong, and we don't want to look at, particularly the president. We might have to admit that there's something wrong with the new psychic makeup of our country.
Richard
Cohen, we
Cohen,
can't afford to do that.
Richard Cohen, what do you think about that?
Well, I think he's got a very good point, and if I can be even more critical of the press than I was originally, I must say that it comes as a surprise to many Americans to find out that an administration that has been yelling and screaming about drugs for many years now has cut the funds for drug rehabilitation by something like 40%. I mean, we are not dealing with the causes of drug abuse. We're not dealing even with the junkies that are out on the street. What we're doing is passing all kinds of palliative measures as if that's going to make a difference. I think it's true that we have to examine why it is that people are using drugs, but I also think that we have to acknowledge our limitations. There are things we're not going to find out. There are limits to education as there are limits to law enforcement, and we may have to live with a certain amount of a drug problem, as we have now for several years, 20 years or more, and continue to do it into the future.
Rick Smith, how do you feel about what Vernon Jarrett said, that the coverage has been superficial? It's been, he didn't use the word, but it's been hyped, it's been surface, and it has not, it hasn't really gotten at the cause of all of this.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, because ultimately that's the toughest question of all, and I think that there are no easy answers to that. I think one of the reasons that the press came late to the drug story is that it's not just a political story or a justice story or a medicine story, and we're not very good at putting those things together. And I think if there's one benefit in all the attention focused on the drug problem now is that we realize how broad it is, and maybe we'll get to some of those questions that Mr. Jarrett raises.
Yeah. Harding Carter, what about the issue of that's been raised by others, that the media should not be involved in wars on anything? It should just report things, and that in this case, the media, when it comes out, even in any, just by its emphasis, comes out against drugs or in support of these anti-drug efforts, that it's wrong. How do you feel about that?
No, I don't think that media, whatever that means, that we in our business should be not enlisting in wars. I wish, however, that we weren't so inclined to always enlist on the same side. We didn't rush forward to all say, aha, it's the newest crusade, and we're all going with it, because nothing's ever quite that simple. That's the part that worries me, not the enlisting, but the fact that everybody rushes to get on board. And the other thing that worries me, of course, is we forget about the effects of past crusades. We forget, in fact, about history all the time. We come at drugs as though there was something new in America, when back in our section of the country, at any rate, Jim, they used to do a great deal of it, and they called it patent medicine. And it was as bad a trouble as there ever was about the turn of the century. We forget how much came in those days. We act as though it's brand new. That's bad history. It's bad journalism.
What you say bad journalism? Richard Cohen used the word worsening journalism. Harding, what is it about the journalism? Let's say that you've seen in Newsweek or you've seen on this program or somebody else's program specifically that offends you, that bothers you the most.
I guess what bothers me the most is the failure always to put what is being done into some context beyond the moment. It is to show the picture you can get easily, which is of somebody sticking it in the arm, somebody going out, rolling the eye, and then the good pounding music or the good pounding headline. And not say to myself, but wait a minute, didn't we do that about air raid shelters in 1961 when John Kennedy got us all to go on a great war? And didn't we have some second thoughts about that great crusade? Didn't we ever stop to think that there's more to the story than that surface bit? That's the worst part of it.
Vernon Jarrett, do you think that this proliferation of news coverage, with all your problems that you have about it, that it's surface in scope, that is at least raising a consciousness about it in the country, and that's good?
I want it to stay a top priority regardless of the reasons why and whatever charges of superficiality may come about, because somebody has got to keep reminding us that every day we have hundreds of young people from the finest of homes, quote, end quote, who still have to rely on drugs. If this drug epidemic, as you call it an epidemic portrayed in the newspapers, do not arouse us to take some action and to go through a period of self-re-examination, it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. I know some young people who have absolutely no reason to use drugs, but they tell me I got a habit.
Do you applaud the action by the President and the Congress in responding and by putting more money into drug programs and passing new laws, etc.?
No, I think President Reagan has one weakness. He does not want to get to the source. I agree with him. You don't do anything by throwing money at it, but you don't do it by throwing money away from research either. And I'm wondering, are most Americans prepared to examine the harsh truth as to why we have so many successful people? You see, drugs weren't looked upon too badly when it was only minorities and a few blacks and a few Mexicans and some musicians using it. But when it started reaching into our better homes, that's when we decided that drugs weren't too great a thing to have around.
He's absolutely right about that.
Well, I can remember when marijuana was considered a black drug. Coke is not considered a black drug anymore because most blacks can't afford it except the cheap. And they said it's a Mexican drug. But now that it's reached into the cream of the crop, we're excited about it. And I'm glad we're excited.
Jim?
Yes.
I just want to add that there is every indication now that cocaine is becoming not a middle-class problem, but it's going to settle down to be an underclass problem. And when that happens, and it happened with heroin, then I dare say that America will lose interest in it.
Is Newsweek going to lose interest in this story?
I think this story is too big and too important to lose interest in it. I don't think we're going to lose interest in terrorism. I don't think we're going to lose interest in the fate of the economy, and I don't think we're going to lose interest in the drug story. And I think what we're likely to do, though, and what I hope all the media will do, is to take it beyond the kind of finger pointing that a problem exists, and really look in a searching way at what can be done about it.
Yeah, somebody
Addiction.
Was that you, Harding?
Yes.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to say, there's a very real problem in America. It's called addiction. It goes across types of drugs. It requires a great deal of education, of information, of research. What it doesn't require are more laws trying to make a criminal matter out of a deep societal problem. And the rush in Congress has been to do things which otherwise would make no sense at all, because, in fact, nobody wants to look at the real problem. As Joe Califano said this morning in an op-ed piece in the New York Times, the former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, we have an American problem called addiction across the board.
All right, gentlemen, let's leave it there. Mr. Jarrett in Chicago, thank you. Richard Cohen, Harding Carter, Rick Smith here in New York.